Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and it has been a long time since I've read to you. Since I've read to you last, I've gotten these cool glasses. Look at those. They're blue light. They have the blue light on them, but look at that. That's really funny. So I'm going to try to keep my glasses tilted down, but if I happen to raise my eyes up, that's what happens. It's kind of funny. The other thing I can do is try to read without my glasses, and that might not work very well. So we'll just have to see the kind of alien look here of my glasses. I have missed you a lot, and life has been busy, but I am back. We're about to start a new school year, and I am excited to be finishing up a book I started long ago, and it is Hudson Taylor, Chapter 11, The Luckiest Man Alive. Each week, Dr. Medhurst held a prayer meeting in his home. Hudson regularly attended the meeting, as did William Burns, a Presbyterian minister from England who had made several trips inland with Hudson. On one particular cold, wintry night, Captain Bowers, captain of the Geelong, a coastal sailing ship that serviced the treaty ports dotted up and down the coast of China, was attending the prayer meeting. He asked for prayer for the city of Swatow, 800 miles to the south. The captain had just come from there and could not forget the awful things that he had seen. Swatow was not a treaty port, but there were many foreigners living there. Most were traders of opium, slaves, and prostitutes. Captain Bowers wanted the group to pray that a missionary would feel called there. Hudson could not get this out of his mind, all that Captain Bowers had said about Swatow. He felt sure God was calling him to go. There was just one problem. He and William Burns had become close friends. Hudson hated the idea of leaving his friend. Indeed, they had become a very effective team, ministering together. But despite his personal feelings, Hudson had to obey God. So he went to tell William Burns his decision. When Hudson finally said he was leaving, a smile spread across William Burns' face. That very evening, he had been going to tell Hudson exactly the same thing. God had called him to Swatow as well. In March 1856, with free passage on the Geelong, the two men set out on their journey south. The ship stayed close to the coastline, and as they got farther south, they could see the plants and the trees become more and more tropical. Apple trees were replaced by banana trees, and the fertile river plain that surrounded Shanghai slowly became steep mountains whose sides had been terraced to grow rice. Silt and mud gave way to long, white, sandy beaches. It was all so warm and bright and lush compared to Shanghai in the winter. In Swatow, the two men rented an attic room above an incense shop. It was a big room that ran the length of the store. To get to it, they had to climb a ladder propped behind a counter. There was no trap door to the room, and anytime someone in the shop was curious about what the foreign devils were doing, they just climbed the ladder and looked in. Hudson learned some of the local dialect, and before long he was preaching in the streets. He and William Burns also set up a small medical clinic. Soon the clinic was bustling with people. Hudson did his best to meet their needs, but he had left most of his medicines, surgical equipment, and books back in Shanghai. For the clinic to be more effective, it was decided that Hudson should make an extended trip back to Shanghai and collect his things. Someone in Shanghai could have saved him the trip if he had been told that a fire in the London missionary storehouse had destroyed all his medical supplies. But since no one had written him, it was a great shock to Hudson when he reached Shanghai. Although discouraged and frustrated by what had happened to his belongings, he decided that after traveling 800 miles, He was not going to return empty-handed, so he set out for Ningpo to see if Dr. Parker had any spare supplies. When he arrived, he found the new hospital nearly finished. Glad to see him, Dr. Parker asked Hudson to help him get things organized. There was much to do. Hudson decided the experience would be useful to him when he returned to Swatow. It was 2 months before everything was organized. Hudson felt great satisfaction as the new hospital opened and began ministering to the medical needs of the local population. The 2 months had given him a good opportunity to get to know John Jones and his wife Mary, who were the latest missionaries to the Chinese Evangelization Society had sent to China. John Jones and Hudson became good friends. They made several short trips together to some of the outlying settlements around Ningpo to preach the gospel and distribute tracts and Bibles. Hudson made another friendship during his 2 months in Ningpo. Every Wednesday evening, the Parkers had dinner with Abby Aldersay and the Dyer sisters. At 60 years of age, Miss Aldersay was a formidable woman. She had been in China a long time and had single-handedly established a large school and orphanage, the first of its kind to be opened in China by Protestants. When Miss Aldersay made up her mind about something, there was no going back. She decided once that an early morning walk was good for her health. So at exactly 5 a.m. every morning, she could be seen walking around the city wall. If it snowed, she wore more clothes. If it was dark or foggy, a servant walked in front of her carrying a lantern. Nothing got in her way of her morning walk. Many Chinese people found it difficult to imagine the mighty British Empire being run by a woman, Queen Victoria. Those who knew Miss Aldersay did not find it strange at all. The Dyer sisters, 21 years old, Brunella, and 19-year-old Maria, came to be in Ningpo through a very roundabout set of circumstances. The girls had been born in Singapore, where their parents were early missionaries with the London Missionary Society. When their father died, their mother married Mr. Bossum. He became the girls' stepfather. Not long after that, their mother died, and Mr. Bossum remarried. The girls continued to live with him and his new wife. Several years later, Mr. Bossum also died. After his death, the girls' uncle, William Tarn, who lived in London, became their guardian. He paid for their education, but the girls remained close to Mrs. Bossum, who, even though she had not known either of their parents, was like a mother to them. Since she was getting on in age, Miss Aldersay had asked Miss Bossum to come to China and prepared to take over the management of the orphanage and school from her. Brunella and Maria agreed to go with her to China. That was how both girls came to be living in Ningpo. During the time the girls had been in Ningpo, Miss Aldersay had given more and more of the control of the orphanage and school over to Miss Bossum. And having more spare time on her hands, she had taken more and more control over what Maria and Brunella did. In her mind, they were fragile young women in a land where men might take advantage of them. They had to be protected, and she was going to do it. For that reason, Miss Aldersay was not pleased when Dr. Parker asked if he could bring Hudson along to dinner at her house. She could have said no, but that would have been bad manners. Yet, to her, Hudson Taylor was an embarrassment to have around. He was short, had dyed hair, and a ridiculous, cute, and wore threadbare Chinese clothes. Really? She asked the girls one evening after he'd left the house. Does he have no pride in being British? For his part, Hudson enjoyed the evenings with Miss Aldersay. Brunella and Maria both sang beautifully, and the food was always English, reminding him of his mother's cooking. He was completely unaware, though, of the effect he was having on one of the two sisters. While Miss Aldersay disliked Hudson more and more with each visit, tall, slim, brown-haired Maria saw him as more exciting and daring than anyone she had ever met. Once the hospital was up and running, Hudson prepared to return to Swatow and his work with William Burns. Dr. Parker gave him much medicine and equipment as he could spare, and Hudson set out for Shanghai. where another ship would take him down the coast to Swatow. When he got to Shanghai, there was an urgent letter waiting for him from William Burns. Burns had decided to take a trip inland from Swatow. In the course of the journey, he and his 2 servants had been arrested by Chinese authorities and put in jail in Canton. Eventually, he had been freed and turned over to the British consul. But now the British consul had forbidden them to return to Swatow and continue their work there. So there was no point in Hudson's returning. Hudson was stunned. It had taken him 3 months to travel and work to get the medicine and equipment he needed for his clinic there. Besides, he enjoyed the work in Swatow. He'd looked forward to getting back there. There was so much to do, so many needs, both medical and spiritual, to be ministered to. What would happen to the people of Swatow without them? As he thought about the situation, he decided he had 2 options, which he waited to see if things changed in Swatow so that he could go back. He could either stay in Shanghai or go back to Ningpo and work with Dr. Parker. He decided to go back to Ningpo. Dr. Parker welcomed him back. Hudson moved into a house on Bridge Street, named for the bridge at the end of the street. Dr. Parker used the house as a school, but the attic was too cold for the children. That was where Hudson slept. On the very cold winter mornings, it wasn't unusual for him to wake up and find a thin layer of snow on top of his quilt that had drifted in through the cracks in the roof. Hudson fit right back into the work of the hospital with Dr. Parker. And with John Jones, he also continued to preach in and around Ningpo. The weeks quickly rolled by, and soon it was Christmas. Everyone tried to have fun because in the back of everyone's mind was the thought that this could be the last Christmas spent together in Ningpo. Even as they danced and sang, the threat of another opium war was never far from their thoughts. The latest situation had started when the Arrow, which was actually a Chinese ship flying the British flag, was boarded and opium was found. The Arrow's crew were dragged off and imprisoned by Chinese officials. The British were furious. How dare Chinese officials board a ship flying the Union Jack? Actually, the Chinese had every right to board the ship, since the Arrow had no right to be flying the British flag in the first place. The British, though, didn't worry too much about that. To them, it was the Chinese trying to interfere with their trade again, and it had to stop. The British demanded an immediate apology, or they would bomb Canton. When the Chinese didn't apologize, the British lit their cannons and bombarded the city. Many foreigners, including Hudson, sided with the Chinese point of view. The British needed to remember that they were guests in a foreign country. But to the Chinese, all foreigners were the same. Some Chinese groups even offered to pay a bounty for the head of every foreign devil brought to them. This put all the foreigners in China in a very difficult situation. In Hong Kong, a baker put arsenic in his bread and sold the loaves only to foreigners. Thankfully, he didn't use quite enough arsenic, and while many people got sick from eating the bread, no one died. In Ningpo itself, a group of Portuguese merchants were attacked and killed. Many missionaries were beginning to think that they should leave Ningpo. China didn't seem to be a safe place anymore. The missionaries knew they were most likely to be attacked when they were all in one group, but they continued to meet for church and prayer meetings anyway. What they didn't know was that a band of angry Chinese men had asked the local magistrate for permission to kill all of the missionaries in Ningpo. The magistrate had given his permission, and all that remained was to wait for the missionaries to gather for church on Sunday. It was arranged that the largest group of men would attack the church service, while a smaller group would round up and kill any missionary who wasn't in church. One of the men planning the attack had a friend who worked for a missionary. He knew that when they carried out their plan, his friend might well be killed along with the foreigners, so he warned him of the attack. The man then told the missionary that employed him about the plan. News spread quickly among the missionaries. They decided to pray about the situation and called a special prayer meeting. At the same time, a junior mandarin heard about the plan to kill the missionaries and went to the magistrate. He pointed out that if all of the missionaries in the city were killed, it would anger foreigners so much that Ningpo would be attacked, just as Canaan had been. He pointed out that the British had the power to kill every Chinese person in Ningpo and level every building in return for an attack. The magistrate had not thought about this, and when he did, it scared him. He quickly sent out an order canceling the attack. The prayers of the missionaries had been answered, but even though their lives had been spared this time, things were still very tense in Ningpo. Some missionaries hired bodyguards, but what was to stop the bodyguards from killing the missionaries? Finally, it was decided that the women and the children should go back to Shanghai and wait there until things settled down in Ningpo. Hudson and John Jones were asked to escort them. The Dyer sisters, though, refused to go. They felt they needed to stay behind and help Miss Blossom keep the orphanage and the school open. 2 boats were hired to take the women and the children to Shanghai. As they sailed up the Grand Canal away from Ningpo, Hudson had the strangest thought. He wondered whether he would ever see Maria again. Back in Shanghai, he couldn't get Maria out of his mind. So he finally wrote a letter to her and asked if she would be willing to get to know him better, with the possibility that they might one day get married. Maria was thrilled to get Hudson's letter. She hadn't even been sure he knew she cared about him, but her joy was over when she told Miss Aldersay about the letter. Miss Aldersay was shocked. How dare Hudson Taylor, the silly little man parading himself around like a Chinaman, think he could marry one of her girls? He could barely support himself. What hope did he have of supporting Maria and making her happy? Such a marriage would be an embarrassment. It was unthinkable, and she was going to make sure it never happened. She immediately wrote a letter to Mr. Tarn, Maria's uncle and guardian in London, and warned him that some undesirable missionary had fallen in love with his niece. Having written that letter, she called Maria to her study and made her write a letter telling Hudson she did not want to marry him and asking him never to mention the subject again. Hudson was disappointed by Maria's letter, but even he'd begun to wonder exactly what he had to offer a wife. He put the letter aside and turned his attention to another troubling matter. Since being in Shanghai, Hudson and John Jones had discovered that the Chinese Evangelization Society was borrowing the money they were sending to their missionaries. This worried both men. Hudson did not believe in borrowing for himself, and he found it difficult to accept someone else borrowing for him. He and John Jones prayed about what they should do. Finally, they both decided they should resign from the Chinese Evangelization Society. Hudson now had no missionary society backing him and no other source of income. He was alone, and he was relying on God to meet all of his needs, just as he had done in Hull and London. While in Shanghai, Hudson also thought a lot about the challenge foreign missionaries faced in China, and he came to a conclusion. China was not going to be reached with the gospel if the job was left to foreigners alone. There were too many difficulties to be overcome. The best thing for foreigners to do was to train Chinese people to take the gospel deep into China to their own people. Hudson shared his insights with John Jones, and the two of them decided that when they got back to Ningpo, they would throw their energy into starting a church in the house on Bridge Street, where they could train up Chinese Christians to go and share the gospel. After 2 months in Shanghai, the situation in Ningpo had settled down, and the women and children were able to return. After we got back, Hudson would sometimes see Maria at a friend's house, but they did not speak to each other as they had more than they had to. But he continued to think about things with Maria. Hudson wondered if Miss Aldersay might be at the bottom of Maria's letter of rejection, so he decided to pay her a visit. It was not a pleasant visit, but he did find out that she had made Maria write the letter to him. He also found out a few other things. Miss Aldersay made it very clear to him that she did not think he was fit to ask anyone to be his wife. Her comments reminded him of the letter from Marianne's father 3 years earlier. After his visit, things got worse for him. Miss Aldersay started rumors about the community around the community about Hudson. But despite her efforts, Hudson would not give up. He had to know how Maria felt about him. The opportunity to ask her came not long afterwards when there was a woman's prayer meeting at the Bridge Street Church. Hudson had gone out for the evening so as not to disturb the women. When he returned, he saw that not all of the women had left. His heart beat faster. He opened the door, and sure enough, Maria was still there, sitting by the window. Mrs. Bossum sat beside her, but Miss Aldersay had already left. This was Hudson's chance. He asked Miss Bossum if he could talk with Maria, and soon the three of them were alone in one of the upstairs rooms. Hudson pretended Mrs. Bossum was not there, as he told Maria that he loved her. Maria smiled and nodded. She loved Hudson, too. Within minutes, things were settled. Hudson would write to Mr. Tarn and ask his permission to marry Maria. When Miss Aldersay found out that Maria and Hudson had met and talked together, she was furious. She wrote Hudson a rude letter, telling him that he ought to be ashamed to call himself a Christian, going around luring young missionary girls who did not know any better. But all her ranting did no good. Mr. Tarn wrote back and gave his permission for Hudson and Maria to be married, and so they were. On January 20, 1858, 1 year after Hudson had taken the women and the children away from Ningpo to safety in Shanghai, he was standing at the front of the church with Maria, who wore a gray silk dress with a long wedding veil. He himself had freshly dyed his queue and brought a new suit of Chinese clothes for the wedding. As he stood at the front of the church, he felt that he was the luckiest man alive to have such a beautiful bride. Hudson and Maria had their honeymoon in a wonderful old monastery in the hills overlooking Ningpo. They were very happy together. Unfortunately, after only 2 weeks of marriage, Maria became very ill. She had typhoid, a disease that was often deadly. Hudson took care of her, but just as she was beginning to get better, Hudson came down with the disease himself. Mrs. Bossum kindly looked after them both, and it was April before Hudson and Maria were well enough to move into the Bridge Street house together. Indeed, it would be many years before Hudson was completely well again. A year went by, and Hudson continued to work hard at establishing a church in the Bridge Street house, while Maria opened a small school for girls. They were happy times for Hudson and Maria, but during the second year of their marriage, some changes took place. In July, a baby daughter was born. They named her Grace Dyer Taylor. She was a pretty little girl, and everyone loved to make her laugh. The next change was a sad one. In August, Dr. Parker's wife became ill with cholera and died within 2 days. Everyone was stunned by her sudden death, and Dr. Parker was too upset to go on with his medical work. He decided to take their 4 children back to Scotland, where his parents could help him raise them. But who would run the hospital he had labored so hard to establish? There was no other qualified doctor in all of Ningpo to take over. The hospital would soon have to close. But what about the dispensary? Here all the eyes fell on Hudson. It wasn't possible for him to keep it open, Hudson protested. Dr. Parker treated private, foreign patients to make money to keep the hospital and dispensary open. Since Hudson was not a qualified doctor, he couldn't do that. Still, he agreed to consider it, and he and Maria fasted and prayed. After several days, Hudson felt that he should take over not only the dispensary, but also the hospital. Somehow, with God's help, they would make it work. Dr. Parker left them with enough money to run the hospital for a month, and then 8 days after burying his wife, he left for Scotland. The hospital turned out to be a wonderful place for the Chinese Christians from the Bridge Street Church to learn how to serve each other. The church had decided that the hospital should be its project. Members of the congregation worked day after day at the hospital without pay. They cleaned and washed and sang and preached. Hudson could not have been happier than to see the Chinese people he had trained reaching out to others. But they still needed money to run the hospital. Everyone watched eagerly as the money ran out. They wondered if Hudson was right. Would God send more money? The situation became serious. A year and a half earlier, Hudson didn't know if he could support a wife, and now he had a wife, a child, and a hospital to pay for. One afternoon, the cook, who was a new convert, came to tell Hudson he had just opened their last bag of rice. At the same moment, the mail arrived. In it was a letter from a Mr. Berger in England and a check for 50 pounds. If Hudson needed more money, Mr. Berger instructed in his letter he just needed to write and say how much more, and the amount would be sent to him. Hudson read the letter to the cook, who ran yelling down the hallway of the hospital, "God answers prayer! God answers prayer!" In the following months, there were many other wonderful answers to prayer that allowed the hospital to keep on ministering to people's needs. The Bridge Street Church also grew to 21 active members, and there were lots of other people who were interested in knowing more about the gospel. Every afternoon, Hudson taught new converts how to read the Bible and follow its teachings. But every afternoon, he found it was a little more difficult to concentrate. He did not like to admit it to himself, but he was becoming a very sick man. That is the end of chapter 11, and the next chapter will be chapter 12, In the Light of Eternity. We'll see what happens next in the life of Hudson Taylor and his family. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.